Sometimes stories begin with thunder, but this one begins with a hush. A boy lying awake, eyes barely open, while the night outside held its breath. Morty wasn't old enough yet to name the feeling, but he carried it as a secret that something was listening to him. The stars outside his window didn't twinkle like everyone said in science books. They pulsed faintly, like a heart beating somewhere far away. He would lie in bed and whisper to them, little words, broken words, sometimes not even words at all. And in the quiet, he imagined that they whispered back. Not loud, not clear, only enough to keep him wondering. It didn't frighten him. Instead, it gave him the sort of comfort a child can't explain. Like when someone hums while you drift to sleep and you don't catch the melody, but the sound itself feels like home. Those whispers became part of his night. He'd say goodnight to the window before he ever said goodnight to himself. And sometimes, if he closed his eyes tight enough, he could feel the whisper travel through him, like the warmth of a small candle he was carrying without knowing it. In those years, life in the house was noisy during the day. Grandfather Rick's footsteps came heavy, mismatched, unpredictable. His voice cut the air like a spark sometimes, brilliant but hard to touch. Morty didn't always understand him, not really. But when Rick stormed out to his garage full of clutter and shadows, Morty would go back to the window, back to the stars, back to the language that didn't need understanding. It was in those long nights that Morty discovered something peculiar about himself. When he thought about tomorrow, he could feel it. Not see it, not exactly, but feel the weight of what tomorrow would bring. Some days carried a lightness, like a page barely touched by ink. Other days felt heavier, as though something unspoken already leaned across the horizon. He couldn't predict tests at school or sudden trips with Rick, but he could sense whether tomorrow would ask him for courage or simply let him drift. One evening he felt that strange heaviness pressing against him while he lay on his pillow. He whispered to the stars, asking what was coming. The window pane rattled gently, though there was no wind. A shadow crossed the room that wasn't his own. Morty didn't move. He wasn't afraid, only curious. And for the first time, he whispered out loud instead of inside his head. "What do you want me to know?" The silence that followed stretched long. He felt his chest slow, his eyelids sink. Just before sleep took him, he heard it, a sound too soft to call a voice, but close enough. It said nothing clear, only a shape of feeling you are part of something bigger than yourself. He didn't know what it meant, but he carried it like a folded note in his pocket. Morning came. School, chores, Rick's half-finished inventions ticking and humming in the garage. Nothing extraordinary. And yet Morty couldn't shake the sense that yesterday's whisper was waiting for him to notice it again. He looked at people differently that day. At his mother, who stirred her coffee with a tired hand. At his sister, who rolled her eyes at him but never truly hated him. At Rick, bent over something glowing on the workbench, muttering words Morty couldn't understand. Everyone seemed fragile, like they too were made of whispers. That night, he dreamed of walking through a meadow of tall grass. Every blade bent slightly toward him as if bowing in greeting. The sky was a gentle silver, not dark, not bright. In the distance stood a figure. He couldn't see its face. It raised its hand, and suddenly Morty felt himself stretching. Not his body, not really. More like his heart, pulled wider and softer than he thought it could go. When he woke, he remembered none of the details clearly, only the feeling of widening. In school the next day, he noticed a boy sitting alone. Morty had seen him before, the way one notices a chair or a locker, but he had never spoken to him. Something tugged at Morty's chest, the same weight from the night before. At lunch he walked over and sat down. The boy looked at him with surprise, as if to say, "Why here?" Morty didn't have an answer. He only took his sandwich and split it in half, placing one half on the boy's tray. The boy hesitated, then accepted. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Morty just felt that something invisible had shifted. Later that night, staring at the stars again, he whispered, "Was that what you wanted me to do?" The stars didn't answer, not in words, but the whispering warmth filled him again. He wondered if Rick would laugh at him for believing such things. He wondered if anyone else ever felt them. But the more Morty listened, the more he realized that these whispers weren't about answers. They were about presence, about being part of something subtle and enormous at the same time. He didn't always understand people's words, but he began to understand their hearts. Sometimes, in the middle of conversations, he felt that widening again, like in his dream. He would look at someone, his mother, his friend, even Rick when he was angry, and suddenly feel their weight, the quiet shape of their burdens. He didn't know what to do with it. Sometimes he only listened. Sometimes he offered nothing more than his company, and somehow that was enough. One evening, Rick caught Morty staring too long out the window. "What are you looking at, kid? Nothing out there but dead rocks and light years," Morty almost told him.
Almost said they talked to me, but instead he just shrugged.
Rick grunted, shuffled away. Morty smiled faintly. The stars pulsed again, like a secret shared only between them. And slowly, without realizing it, Morty began to grow into the habit of noticing the quiet moments others overlooked, noticing the tiny ways people asked for kindness without words. He wasn't brave in the way stories described heroes, but he carried that folded note in his heart, the reminder that he was part of something larger, something gentle. Years later, he would look back at those nights and wonder if the stars had really spoken, or if he had spoken to himself through them. But as a boy, lying in the dark, listening to whispers only he could hear, he never doubted. He felt loved, guided, and strangely unafraid of tomorrow. And even now, if you listen closely, maybe you can hear the stars whispering to you too. The next memory came with the soft crunch of bread. Morty was only a little older, but already the days seemed longer, the air heavier with the weight of unspoken things. He had begun to grow into the habit of watching the world as if it carried secret instructions. Even a sandwich, ordinary as it looked, seemed to hold some quiet lesson. It happened one afternoon in the kitchen. His mother had made lunch absent-mindedly, distracted by thoughts she didn't share. Morty sat at the table, the plate before him holding a sandwich so plain it should have disappeared into forgetfulness. But when he bit into it, something strange occurred. He chewed, swallowed, and looked down to see that the sandwich had not shrunk. It remained whole, as though untouched. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and tried again. Another bite, another chew, and still the sandwich remained. Each taste was real, soft bread, lettuce, the faint tang of mustard, but nothing diminished. A feeling of wonder rose in him, quiet but steady. He didn't call out. He didn't want to share it yet. He wanted to sit with it, just him and this endless, ordinary meal. Bite after bite, the sandwich gave itself freely. Morty began to laugh softly, though he kept it hidden behind his hand. Not a sharp laugh, not one of surprise, but the laugh of a boy who has discovered a secret toy the world forgot to take away. And as he ate, he noticed something more. With each bite, he felt a little lighter. The worry he carried from his father's absence, the unease of Rick's experiments, the quiet loneliness that sometimes crept into his room at night, they loosened, like knots untangling themselves. When the plate was finally empty, though it had never seemed to change, Morty sat back in silence. He touched his lips, half afraid the sandwich would return, but it didn't. It had given what it came to give. He sat in the kitchen for a long while, the sun painting the table in gentle squares, and wondered what it meant. That evening, lying in bed, he whispered to the stars again.
"Why the sandwich?"
he asked almost shyly. The whisper came as warmth in his chest, as though the stars were smiling without mouths. He understood, in a way that words could never quite hold, that the sandwich was not magic. It was a mirror. A lesson that some things, kindness, patience, wonder, didn't run out when you gave them away. Morty carried that image with him in the days that followed. He would see someone holding a heavy book and instinctively step forward to share the weight. He would notice his sister looking sad in a way she didn't admit, and instead of questioning, he would simply sit beside her, offering presents without demands. Each act felt like a bite of the endless sandwich, nourishing him as much as anyone else. Rick, of course, didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but pretended not to. One afternoon, Morty tried to explain.
Grandpa,
Do you ever feel like things don't run out, like they keep going even when you give them away? Rick snorted, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag.
that's thermodynamics, kid.
Entropy eats everything in the end. Nothing's endless.
Not food, not time, not even me. His voice carried a strange bitterness, sharp as broken glass.
Morty lowered his gaze, but somewhere inside he felt the stars humming in disagreement. He didn't argue. He only thought of the sandwich again and how it had filled him without depleting. He wondered if maybe Rick had never tasted anything like that, something that fed without loss. The thought made Morty ache for him, just a little. The next week, during lunch at school, Morty found himself staring at his tray. The sandwich wasn't bottomless anymore, just ordinary bread and filling. But when he noticed another kid watching hungrily from a nearby table, Morty remembered the lesson. Without hesitation, he walked over, offered half, and sat down. The boy's eyes widened. "Why you—" he began, but stopped when Morty shrugged and said, "Because I have enough." They ate together in silence. The food ran out, but the quiet connection remained. Later that night, Morty thought about how the sandwich might not have been about the food at all. It was about learning to trust that he had more to give than he realized. Days blurred into weeks, and the motif of giving grew in him. Each time he shared something small, a pencil, a smile, a listening ear, he felt the stars leaning closer. He began to imagine that they were singing, though their song was too vast to hear clearly. He carried that sound into sleep, where dreams came soft and strange. One dream showed him sitting at a table that stretched endlessly in both directions. Upon it lay sandwiches, fruit, cups of water, more than he could ever eat. Across from him sat countless others, friends, strangers, faces he did not yet know. Each reached for food, and each found plenty.
No one hoarded, no one clutched.
The table never emptied. Morty woke with tears on his cheeks, though he didn't know why. When he told Rick, in a hesitant voice, about the dream, Rick scoffed again.
Sounds like a socialist buffet.
"Kid, dreams don't mean anything except that your neurons are firing off at random." Morty nodded, but he felt a pang of sorrow, not for himself, but for Rick. It was painful to imagine living in a world where nothing could be endless, where every gift cost too much to give. And so Morty held his dream close, like a lantern inside his chest. He began to notice how other people clutched at things, possessions, pride, fears, and he tried, in his own small way, to offer them a taste of the sandwich that had once been endless. Sometimes it was as simple as holding a door longer than expected. Sometimes it was listening to someone complain without judging them. Tiny things, but together they formed a pattern, a melody. There were moments he doubted himself, when he gave and no one gave back, when kindness was met with silence, or worse, with mockery. But even then, he remembered the feeling in the kitchen, the sun on the table, the laughter behind his hand, the sandwich that asked nothing of him yet gave until he was full. And in those moments of doubt, the memory carried him through. One night he whispered, "What if I run out?" The stars seemed to pulse a little brighter, as though to say, "You won't." The warmth spread again through his chest, and Morty fell asleep, knowing he was not a well to be drained, but a river that flowed, always finding its way. Years later, he would recall the story differently, unsure if the sandwich had truly remained whole, or if his young mind had only imagined it. But it didn't matter. The lesson had rooted deep, that giving didn't empty him, that love shared multiplied, that even in a world filled with strange machines and cold equations, there existed something that could not be measured or diminished. For now, he was only a boy with a memory too peculiar to explain, carrying it quietly like a charm in his pocket. And somewhere above, the stars kept whispering, not in words, but in the steady rhythm of light, enough, enough, enough. Morty had grown used to nights with whispers and days with quiet noticing, but there were still corners of his life that held a different kind of mystery, shadows that belonged not to the stars, but to the figure who moved restlessly through the house. His grandfather carried a weight that Morty didn't yet understand, a gravity that pulled both sharpness and brilliance into the same orbit. Rick was not like the others. He was storms and silence stitched together, and Morty often found himself lingering at doorways, watching him the way one watches a flame, dangerous, unpredictable, and impossible to look away from. The garage was Rick's world. Its air was heavy with the scent of metal and something acrid that Morty couldn't name. Machines clattered, lights blinked, and half-built shapes lay sprawled across the tables as though they were sleeping beasts. Morty would sometimes sneak inside, tiptoeing through the maze of parts. He never touched anything. He only wanted to be near the hum, near the strange energy that lived in the walls. Rick often chased him out with a muttered curse, but Morty always returned, patient and quiet. One evening, Morty stood just beyond the threshold, watching. Rick was hunched over a small device, something glowing faintly blue. His face was lined with exhaustion, his hands steady despite the faint tremor of too much drink, too many nights awake. Morty wanted to ask what it was, but instead he whispered a soft question that had lived in him for weeks. "Do you ever hear the stars?" Rick froze for a moment, then snorted. "Stars don't talk, kid. They burn, they collapse, they explode."
That's it. You're hearing your own head. Morty nodded, though he felt a sting inside.
He wanted to argue, to insist, but something told him that Rick's world was built from walls he had long ago decided not to climb. So Morty stayed quiet, leaning against the doorframe. He studied Rick's silhouette, the way the shadows stretched behind him, long and uneven, like echoes that never fully faded. Later that night, Morty dreamed again. This time, he stood in the garage, but it was different. Vast, endless, the machines towering like monuments. In the center sat Rick, smaller than the machines around him, his face hidden. Morty walked closer and saw that Rick's shadow was longer than his body, stretching farther and farther until it touched the edges of the dream. The shadow seemed to carry sorrow, not malice, a sadness so deep it couldn't be spoken. Morty reached out, trying to hold it, but the shadow dissolved between his fingers. He woke with a damp pillow, though he didn't remember crying. The dream stayed with him all morning. When Rick passed by with his usual brusque muttering, Morty stared at him with quiet tenderness.
He didn't see the storm.
He saw the shadow behind it. School felt smaller after that dream. The classrooms, the chatter, the tests, they all seemed temporary, as though paper walls surrounded him and could be pushed down with the gentlest touch. Morty began to look for shadows in others too. His teacher, speaking firmly at the board, carried a weariness in her shoulders. A classmate who laughed too loudly seemed to cover an emptiness that peeked through in the pauses. Everywhere Morty looked, he saw more than faces. He saw the quiet darkness people carried behind them. That afternoon, he sat with his sandwich, ordinary again, though still precious, and noticed a girl across the cafeteria with tears she thought no one saw. Morty hesitated. He wasn't sure what to do. He remembered the dream, the endless shadow in Rick's garage, and how it had slipped from his hands when he tried to hold it. Maybe shadows weren't meant to be held. Maybe they only wanted to be seen, so Morty didn't speak to the girl.
He only caught her eye, and when she quickly looked away, he offered a faint smile she might never return.
Still, something in her expression softened, if only for a moment. Morty felt the stars humming inside him, telling him that sometimes recognition was enough. That night, Rick barged into Morty's room.
"You've been moping around.
"What's going on?"
Somebody at school mess with you?"
Morty shook his head.
"No, just thinking." Rick rolled his eyes.
"Don't waste time on that. Thinking doesn't fix anything." Doing does. Morty wanted to tell him that sometimes thinking was a kind of doing, that listening could be an action, that noticing could change more than force ever could. But the words stayed locked in his throat. Rick wouldn't understand. Or maybe he would, but not in the way Morty meant. So he only nodded again. Rick grumbled, muttered something about experiments, and left. Something about experiments, and left. When Morty was alone again, he whispered toward the window. "Why do people carry shadows?" The stars gave no answer this time, only their steady pulse, like a reminder that questions mattered, even when answers did not. Morty lay awake longer than usual, the rhythm of the stars weaving through his thoughts until sleep came like a slow tide. In his dream, he walked through a forest where every tree cast a shadow larger than itself. The air was heavy with quiet, and Morty felt both lost and guided at once. He touched one tree, then another, and each shadow whispered a different memory, regrets, fears, moments of love left unsaid. Morty listened, letting them pass through him until the forest itself seemed to exhale. When he woke, his chest was heavy, but not unbearably so. It was the weight of empathy, of carrying something that didn't belong only to him. Over the following days, Morty became gentler without meaning to. He paused before speaking. He noticed pauses in others. He walked slower in the hallways, as though not to step on invisible threads. His sister called him weird, his classmates ignored him, but he didn't mind. He wasn't searching for attention. He was searching for presence. Rick, though, remained a storm. Loud, clever, half-destroyed by his own brilliance. Morty wondered if Rick had once heard the stars too before deciding they were silent. He wondered if Rick had tasted an endless sandwich once and then convinced himself it was an illusion. The thought made Morty's heart ache again, but also gave him hope. If Rick carried shadows that deep, maybe, one day, Morty's quiet light could reach them. For now, he didn't push. He only kept listening to the stars, to the shadows, to the fragile music of people being human. Each whisper, each shadow, folded itself into Morty's growing understanding. He was not becoming a hero in the way books described. He was becoming a witness, a keeper of gentle truths, and somewhere in the stillness, the stars pulsed once more, whispering not in words, but in their steady rhythm. See, the daytime stumbled began like any other. Morty woke to the sound of clinking dishes downstairs, the faint hum of Rick's garage door rattling against its frame, and the sunlight spilling unevenly across his blanket. But as he rose, something felt off. Not wrong, not dangerous, just tilted, as though the world had shifted half a step to the left. At breakfast, his mother stirred her coffee, but Morty noticed she repeated the motion 3 times.
Identical, as if someone had pressed rewind on her hand.
She didn't notice. His sister muttered something sarcastic, but Morty swore he had already heard it seconds before. Even Rick, storming through the kitchen with a muttered complaint, paused, shook his head, then walked the same path again, as though retracing his steps. Morty blinked, unsure if it was his imagination, but the air itself carried a faint hum, the way wires sometimes buzz when you press your ear to a wall. He felt the weight of tomorrow pressing strangely forward, heavier than usual, dragging on his chest. Something in the rhythm of time was bending. At school, the feeling grew sharper. He sat in math class watching numbers smear across the board, when suddenly the teacher repeated the same sentence in the exact same tone. Students groaned, but none seemed alarmed. Morty looked around, heart quickening.
He whispered to himself, did that just happen twice?
Nobody answered. Nobody even blinked. During recess, he stood by the fence, staring at the clock above the gymnasium. The second hand ticked forward, then back, then forward again, as though unsure of its duty. Morty felt dizzy, like he was watching a heartbeat falter. He pressed his palms together, closed his eyes, and tried to breathe. The stars were too far to whisper to in daylight, yet he still reached inward, listening. That was when it happened. A rush of silence fell over him. The playground noise dimmed, the shouts and laughter stretched thin, and for a moment Morty stood outside of time. The air tasted metallic, like lightning waiting to strike. He opened his eyes and the world had frozen. A basketball hung mid-bounce. A bird perched in mid-air, wings outstretched but unmoving. Children's faces locked mid-expression, laughter carved into stillness. Morty's breath echoed loudly in the quiet. He took one step, then another, each footfall sounding deeper than it should. The world wasn't gone, it was paused. He reached for the basketball, touched it with trembling fingers, and felt its weight. Real, solid but suspended. He pulled his hand away quickly as though the ball might shatter. He whispered, "Why me?" But no one answered.
Only the silence pressed closer, heavy and endless, and then just as suddenly the world lurched forward.
The bird flew, the ball bounced, laughter rang again. No one noticed the pause. No one except Morty. He sat down hard on the ground, dizzy. His chest ached with the knowledge that he had seen something fragile, something hidden beneath the skin of ordinary life. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the stars to appear. When they finally did, pulsing faintly through his window, he whispered. Time stumbled.
I saw it. What does that mean?
The answer came not in words, but in rhythm. A pulse, slower than usual, steadier, as though the stars were reminding him. Time itself was not flawless. It was stitched together, sometimes unevenly. Morty closed his eyes and thought of the paused world, the suspended bird, the silence that felt like infinity. It frightened him, but it also filled him with awe. If time could stumble, then maybe everything could stumble.
Maybe even pain.
Maybe even loneliness. Over the next few days, Morty noticed smaller stumbles.
His mother dropping the same spoon twice, exactly the same way.
A teacher mispronouncing a word, then mispronouncing it again, as if trapped in a loop. Once he saw his own hand reach for a pencil twice, though he was certain he had already picked it up. He didn't tell Rick. Rick would dismiss it, or worse, explain it with equations that drained the mystery away. Morty wanted to keep this one for himself. It felt like a secret gift, even if it left him uneasy. But one evening, as he sat on the porch, watching the horizon fade, Rick appeared beside him with a flask in hand. "You've been quiet," he muttered, his tone softer than usual. Morty hesitated. "Do you ever notice things repeating?"
Like time messing up?
Rick smirked faintly, not looking at him.
Kid, time's a mess. Always has been.
Loops, fractures, paradoxes.
If you're starting to notice, well...
He took a swig. "Guess you're finally paying attention." Morty looked at him, surprised. "So it's real?" Rick shrugged. "Real enough. Doesn't matter. You learn to live with it." His eyes, for once, carried no fire.
Only weariness.
Morty wanted to ask more, but Rick stood and wandered back to the garage before he could. That night, Morty dreamed of clocks. Thousands of them, all ticking out of rhythm, their hands spinning faster and slower, colliding, breaking. He walked through the forest of clocks, listening to the chaos, and yet somewhere in the distance he heard a steady beat. One clock, hidden, keeping perfect time. He searched for it, but woke before he could find it. The dream stayed with him, like a riddle without an answer. He began to listen for that hidden clock in his waking hours, in the pauses between breaths, in the silences people carried. Sometimes he thought he almost heard it, faint as a lullaby just beyond reach. And so Morty carried on, walking through days that sometimes stuttered, and nights that always whispered. He felt both smaller and larger than before, a child caught in the machinery of something vast. But instead of breaking under it, he found himself softening. Time was fragile. People were fragile.
And maybe, just maybe,
That was what made them beautiful. One afternoon, as he sat under a tree, he closed his eyes and whispered, "If time can stumble, then so can I, and maybe that's okay." The breeze stirred gently, carrying no reply, and yet Morty felt answered all the same. Morty never thought of himself as brave. Courage belonged to the kids who raised their hands first, who spoke loudly in class, who stood tall on playgrounds where shadows stretched long. He was quiet, unsure, often stumbling through sentences as though his own words didn't fully belong to him. But courage, as he would learn, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet enough to go unnoticed, even by the one carrying it. It began with a small moment at school. A boy named Aaron, bigger than most, had a habit of mocking others, his laughter sharp like pebbles against glass. Morty usually stayed out of his way. But one afternoon, Aaron cornered another boy by the lockers, a thin kid whose name Morty barely knew. The boy's face had gone pale, his books clutched tight to his chest, while Aaron grinned with cruel delight. Morty froze, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to do. His mind flickered to the stars, to the sandwich, to the stumble of time, and for a moment he felt the weight of tomorrow pressing hard. If he walked away, tomorrow would be heavy. If he stayed, maybe tomorrow would be lighter, even just a little. He didn't think about winning or losing. He thought about the boy's eyes, wide with fear. So Morty stepped forward. His voice shook, but he managed a simple word: "Stop." Aaron turned, surprised. "What? Stop?" Morty repeated, softer but steadier. He didn't shout. He didn't push. He only looked at Aaron the way he had looked at shadows in the forest of his dreams, with recognition, not fear. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Aaron snorted, rolled his eyes, and walked away, muttering. The thin boy let out a shaky breath, clutching his books tighter. Morty didn't wait for thanks. He only nodded once, then walked to class. His chest trembled, his palms were sweaty, but something deep within him felt steady. That night, lying under the pulse of the stars, Morty whispered, "I wasn't strong. I was scared." The stars answered not with denial but with warmth, as if to say, courage isn't the absence of fear, but the act of moving through it. Morty let the truth settle into him like a soft blanket. In the days that followed, Morty found himself standing a little straighter. Not much, just enough. He began noticing moments where courage could take root, small, ordinary moments that seemed invisible to others. When a teacher dropped her chalk, Morty was the one to quietly pick it up. When his sister rolled her eyes too harshly, hiding hurt beneath the gesture, Morty offered her a smile she pretended not to want. Each act was tiny, but together they formed a quiet rhythm, like footsteps on a path no one else saw. Rick noticed, though he never said it directly. One evening, as Morty lingered in the garage, Rick grunted, "You're different lately. Less whiny, more..."
I don't know, solid? Morty shrugged, unsure how to explain.
He didn't feel solid. He felt soft, stretched thin, like the dream of widening. But well, maybe softness itself was a kind of strength. Rick muttered something about resilience, then buried himself in his work again. Morty smiled faintly, realizing that sometimes even storms noticed the smallest lights. Dreams came often now, weaving themselves into Morty's nights like threads of a tapestry. In one, he walked along a river where the water flowed backward. He saw children dropping stones into it, laughing as the ripples ran toward the past. Morty knelt, cupped his hands in the water, and felt courage flowing into him, cool and clear. When he woke, he carried the feeling as though it was still wet in his palms. Another day, he found himself in the cafeteria again, facing Aaron's laughter. This time, it wasn't at another student, it was at Morty himself. Something about the way he held his tray, the way his voice cracked when he asked for milk. The laughter stung, but Morty remembered the river dream. He let the sting wash through him, let it ripple backward into silence, and simply sat down without replying. His quiet steadiness unsettled Aaron more than any comeback could have. Morty realized then that courage wasn't always standing up. Sometimes it was not bowing down. His mother noticed too. One evening, as she tucked away dishes, she looked at him with gentle curiosity. "You seem calmer these days, Morty, like you've grown a little older." Morty only nodded. He didn't know how to explain that courage had become less about doing something dramatic and more about listening to the whisper of what was needed. Sometimes courage was defending someone. Sometimes it was sharing a sandwich. Sometimes it was simply seeing someone's shadow without looking away. But Rick, as always, cast the longest shadow in Morty's world. One night, Morty found him slumped at the kitchen table, an empty flask nearby, his head in his hands. Morty hesitated. Approaching Rick felt like stepping into a storm. But then he remembered the boy by the lockers, the stumble of time, the endless sandwich. Courage wasn't about strength. It was about presence, so Morty sat down across from him. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He only sat waiting. Rick glanced at him, eyes bleary, then muttered, "You think sitting there's going to fix anything?" Morty shook his head.
"No, but I'm here." Rick stared at him for a long time, then laughed bitterly.
Yet beneath the laugh, something softened in his gaze. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Morty felt the stars whispering again, pulsing through the silence. This too is courage. That night, Morty dreamed not of rivers or forests, but of a single candle burning in the dark. Its flame was small, fragile, almost swallowed by the shadows, but it did not go out. Morty watched it flicker, steady and stubborn, and realized the candle was him. When he woke, he carried the image like a secret talisman. As the weeks turned, Morty no longer questioned whether he was brave. He understood now that courage wasn't a crown or a shout. It was a whisper, a hand held out, a willingness to stand in silence when silence was needed. It was the small flame that refused to go out.
Even in the storm of Rick's world, even in the stumble of time. And so?
Morty grew quietly, softly. Not into a hero, but into something gentler. A witness, a keeper, a light small enough to comfort, steady enough to endure. Morty began to notice it in fragments, the way a dream first lingers in the corners of waking thought before fading. At first, it was nothing more than a feeling, subtle and shapeless. When someone spoke, their words carried weight, but Morty felt something beneath the words, a heaviness, a lightness, a pressure in the air that seemed to whisper of choices not yet made. He told himself it was just guessing, intuition, the kind anyone might have. Yet the feeling grew. One afternoon in class, the teacher asked if anyone knew the answer to a question about history. A few hands twitched, then fell. Morty felt the weight shift in the room, as though the silence itself leaned toward a particular student. He turned his head just as a girl across the aisle hesitated, about to speak, but stopping herself. Morty felt it, the heaviness of her decision not to raise her hand, the soft lightness of what might have been if she had. He knew, without knowing why, that she had the answer. When she finally whispered it under her breath, almost too quietly for anyone to hear, Morty was not surprised. That night, lying in his bed, Morty whispered to the stars again. "Why me?" He expected no reply, only silence and distance. Yet the stars pulsed gently, as if they were listening, as if the universe itself held him in quiet regard. Morty thought back to the stumble of time, the sandwich that never emptied, the candle in the dark. Each had been strange, unexplainable, yet none felt frightening. This new feeling was the same. Not a gift of power, but of presence. Not sight into the future, but a tenderness toward what might unfold. The first time he tested it, Morty did so without meaning to. His sister was at the kitchen table, scribbling in frustration, erasing furiously until the paper tore. Morty stood in the doorway watching. He felt it, the sharp heaviness of her decision to give up, to push the paper away, to leave her homework undone. And alongside it, the faint lightness of another path, one where she took a breath, tried again, softened. He walked forward quietly and placed a glass of water beside her. She looked at him, puzzled.
What? Just
"Drink," Morty murmured. She frowned, then sighed, taking the glass. She sipped, and Morty felt the heaviness ease, the lightness grow. She didn't thank him, but she didn't give up either. She erased one last time, then started again, calmer now. Morty slipped away, his heart trembling. He hadn't controlled her choice. He had only nudged, as if holding out a hand to steady someone on a narrow path. In the days that followed, he began to feel these shifts everywhere. At school, in the hallways, in the kitchen with Rick, mumbling to himself. They came like echoes, faint but insistent, pulling Morty into a deeper awareness of people around him. A classmate debating whether to speak up, a neighbor deciding whether to scold her child or kneel down and listen. Even Rick, caught in his spirals, weighed down by choices Morty could almost feel pressing on him. Rick, of course, noticed something. He always noticed. One evening, Morty lingered in the garage, his hands brushing over tools he didn't fully understand. Rick squinted at him. "You're staring at me like you know what I'm going to say before I say it." Morty froze. He wanted to tell him, to explain the strange sensation of weight and light that clung to every choice. But how could he? Rick believed in equations, circuits, matter bending under will. He didn't believe in whispers of possibility. Morty shrugged instead. "Just thinking." Morty shrugged instead. "Just thinking." Rick muttered something about kids and their weird silences, then turned back to his work. Yet Morty saw it again, the heaviness on Rick's shoulders, the faint pull of lightness he never chose. Rick seemed to carry 1,000 decisions unmade, each one weighing him down. Morty wanted to lift them, but he knew he couldn't. Some choices were storms no one else could calm. Morty's dreams deepened, carrying him further into the strangeness. He walked through fields of sand where every grain shimmered with a possibility. When he picked one up, it dissolved into starlight. He walked through forests where the trees leaned toward or away from him, depending on which path he thought to take. In one dream, he stood at a crossroads where dozens of versions of himself waited, each reflecting a decision not yet made. They didn't speak. They only watched him with quiet eyes, as if reminding him that each choice was both his and not his. He woke with a shiver, yet not with fear. The strangeness felt less like a burden and more like a song playing in the background of life, one only he seemed able to hear. One morning at school, a classmate dropped her books in the hallway. Everyone stepped around her, too hurried, too indifferent. Morty bent down to help. As he gathered the scattered pages, he felt the heaviness of her decision to mutter thanks without meeting his eyes, to retreat into her usual quiet. But he also felt the flicker of lightness in her hesitating glance. So Morty smiled, a small, patient smile. She met his eyes for half a second longer than she meant to. It wasn't much, but Morty knew something had shifted. Later that day, sitting by himself at lunch, Morty thought about what this meant. He wasn't saving the world. He wasn't defeating monsters. He wasn't outsmarting anyone. He was only catching glimpses of how fragile each decision was, how it could tilt one way or another. And somehow, by being present, by holding steady, he made the lighter path just a little easier to step onto. That evening, Rick caught him staring at the stars. You look like you're waiting for them to talk back, Rick said, half a joke, half annoyed. Morty didn't answer at first. Then he whispered, "Sometimes they do." Rick frowned, about to argue, then stopped. For once he said nothing. He only followed Morty's gaze upward, as if the silence might hold something even he couldn't calculate. Morty felt it then, more strongly than ever, the weight of choices, the light of possibilities, all stretching outward like constellations. He realized his strange talent wasn't about predicting the future. It was about feeling the tenderness of what could be and choosing to stand quietly where the light was. And so Morty carried it, not as a weapon, not as a secret to be hidden, but as a kind of listening, a listening so deep it became its own form of love. Morty first noticed the window one evening when the house had gone still. The air was heavy with quiet, the kind that comes after everyone has given in to sleep, but before the night has fully settled. He sat at his desk, the glow of a small lamp bending shadows across the room. His eyes drifted to the glass of the window by his bed, expecting only the usual sight of faint stars and the vague outline of trees. But there was something different that night, something that made him pause, made his heart stumble. It wasn't the stars he saw.
Or rather, it wasn't only the stars.
In the reflection of the glass, he caught sight of another boy. At first he thought it was himself, the way reflections usually were. But this boy's posture was different, his eyes sharper, his mouth set in a line that Morty rarely wore. It was him and not him, as if the mirror had grown tired of repeating and decided to invent. Morty leaned closer, and the boy in the window leaned too, but a fraction slower, as though obeying his own rhythm. Morty raised his hand. The boy hesitated, then raised his a moment later. A strange ripple moved through Morty's chest, equal parts wonder and unease. He whispered, "Who are you?" The boy didn't answer, but his lips moved faintly as if trying to shape the same question. For nights afterward, Morty returned to the window. Sometimes the reflection was just a reflection, familiar and ordinary. But sometimes it shifted again, showing him this other self, this version of him who seemed carved from sharper lines, who carried his shoulders as though expecting a weight Morty had not yet known. They never spoke, not truly. But Morty felt something pass between them, like an echo that had crossed a long distance to find its source. At school, Morty carried the secret with him. While others laughed or bickered or filled the halls with noise, he thought of the boy in the glass. He wondered what life had shaped him into such a version. Was he braver? Colder? Kinder? Crueler? Each possibility stirred something deep inside Morty, as though his own choices were reflected back in those silent eyes. One afternoon, Morty sat beneath a tree, notebook open, pencil unmoving. He thought about the talent he had begun to notice, the way he could feel the weight of decisions before they landed. He wondered if the boy in the window felt it too, or if his sharper gaze came from a different kind of knowing. The wind moved gently through the branches, scattering leaves like little decisions falling, each one choosing where to land. Morty whispered to himself, "Maybe he's what happens if I choose differently." That night, when the reflection stirred again, Morty asked aloud, "Do you understand me?" The boy's eyes flickered, softer now, almost weary. Morty thought he saw a nod, but it might have been the shifting of light. Still, the gesture lingered in Morty's mind long after he crawled into bed. Dreams deepened. He wandered through a hall of mirrors, each one showing not distorted images, but other versions of himself. Some were smaller, younger, clinging to toys he no longer owned. Some were older, taller, with tired eyes that looked past him. Each one bore a trace of him, yet each carried choices Morty hadn't made. He passed them slowly, reverently, whispering greetings he knew they couldn't hear. Near the end of the hall, he saw the boy from the window again, waiting with that same sharp, steady gaze. But this time, instead of reflection, the boy reached out, palm open. Morty reached too, but just as their hands were about to touch, he woke. The dream left him with a trembling ache, as though something important had slipped just out of reach. At breakfast, he stared at his cereal, the clinking spoon forgotten. His mother's voice broke through his daze. "You okay, Morty?" He blinked, nodded.
"Yeah, just thinking." Rick, across the table, smirked.
Dangerous habit. But even his sarcasm couldn't shake Morty's quiet reflection. As the days passed, Morty began to sense that the window wasn't only glass. It was a threshold, a reminder that who we are is always brushing against who we might have been. The boy in the reflection wasn't an enemy. He wasn't even a warning. He was a companion walking a path parallel to Morty's, close enough that sometimes their footsteps echoed in unison. One evening, Morty sat by the window with the lamp off, letting darkness breathe around him. He whispered, "I don't know if you're real, but even if you're not, thank you. You make me think about who I'm becoming." For the first time, the boy in the window smiled. Not a full smile, not wide or bright, but a small one, enough to soften his sharp edges. Morty felt warmth flood through him, a reassurance deeper than words. From then on, Morty carried the boy with him, even when the window showed only his ordinary reflection. He carried him into conversations, into choices, into the quiet courage of each day. When he felt uncertain, when decisions pressed heavily, he thought of that other gaze, steady and unflinching, and found himself a little braver. Rick noticed again, though in his own way. Late one night, Rick glanced at Morty lingering by the window and muttered,
"You're staring like you're expecting company." Morty hesitated,
then whispered, "Maybe I am." Rick rolled his eyes, but didn't press. Still, Morty thought he saw something flicker in his grandfather's expression, something almost like recognition. The window between worlds never fully explained itself. It didn't need to. It was enough that Morty had glimpsed what could be, enough that he had learned to see himself not as fixed, but as unfolding. And though the boy in the reflection remained silent, Morty felt less alone, as though even in his quietest doubts, someone else was walking beside him. And in that quiet companionship, Morty found another form of courage, not the kind that stood against others, but the kind that stood with himself. Morty had always felt the quiet weight of choices, but one evening he began to notice a different kind of pull. It came not from the stars or from the softened whispers of his own reflection, but from a shadow that felt heavier, denser, as though the air itself thickened when it passed. He didn't see it first, he felt it.
A hush inside him, like the moment before thunder cracks. Like the moment before thunder cracks.
It happened in the hallway at school. Morty was reaching for his locker, moving in the small rhythm of daily life, when he felt it, a weight colder than any he had known. He turned, expecting Aaron's usual smirk, or perhaps just a stranger's stare. But what he saw was nothing unusual. Students shuffling, books opening, doors creaking, and yet among them he sensed it. A thread of possibility stretched darker than the rest. His eyes landed on another version of himself, or perhaps a shadow of that idea, woven into the crowd. For a heartbeat, he thought he glimpsed eyes that looked like his own, but sharper, emptier. When he blinked, the face was gone. That night, the dream came. Morty stood in a place without walls, a field of glass stretching endlessly beneath him. Each pane reflected a version of himself, some laughing, some crying, some walking with heads bowed or lifted. But one reflection was different. It stood still, silent, not laughing or crying, only watching. Its eyes were the same as his, yet they carried no softness, only a hard gleam that made Morty shiver. This reflection did not reach out, did not smile. It simply waited. When Morty woke, he whispered to the dark, "Who are you?" The room answered only with silence, though Morty felt the pulse of the stars as though they too were uneasy. Days blurred gently into weeks, but the shadow stayed near, like a scent he couldn't shake.
He sensed it when classmates whispered harshly to each other, when Rick's sarcasm cut too deeply, when his sister clenched her fists at nothing.
It was always there, hovering in the pause before someone chose cruelty. Morty realized then that what he was sensing wasn't just possibility. It was the echo of something colder, the path of decisions made without care, without love. One evening, Morty sat at the kitchen table, doodling circles in his notebook while Rick tinkered with wires nearby. The silence stretched until Morty asked softly, "Rick, do you ever feel like there's another version of you out there, doing everything wrong on purpose?" Rick grunted.
Kid, there are infinite versions of me out there.
Some geniuses, some idiots, some... Let's just say you wouldn't want to meet them in a dark alley.
Why? Morty hesitated.
He wanted to explain the heaviness, the shadow self he kept sensing, but he only shrugged, just wondering. Rick gave him a long look, then went back to his work, muttering about multiverses. But Morty noticed how his hands stilled for a second, as though even Rick, in his own storm, recognized the truth of the question. That night, the dream returned. Morty walked a narrow bridge across a sea of stars. On the opposite side stood the reflection again, waiting, patient. Morty's steps echoed softly on the bridge, each one steady but trembling. When he reached the middle, he stopped. The shadow lifted its hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture almost like dismissal. The stars beneath them flickered, some dimming, some flaring. Morty felt the pull, as though the shadow invited him to step closer, to abandon the softness he carried. For a moment Morty wavered. Then he whispered, "No." The shadow tilted its head, expression unreadable. Then the dream dissolved. Morty woke with his heart racing, yet he didn't feel defeated. The heaviness lingered, but alongside it was a quiet strength. He had said no. Perhaps the shadow was not there to defeat him, but to remind him of the choices he could make and the weight of refusing them. In the days that followed, Morty grew more attuned. When someone around him was on the edge of cruelty, Morty felt the echo stronger. Sometimes he nudged gently, offering a word, a look, a small kindness that shifted the balance. Other times he simply listened, bearing witness so the weight would not be carried alone. He knew he couldn't erase the shadow, but he could answer it. One afternoon, Morty found himself sitting beneath the same tree where he had once wondered about his reflection. He closed his eyes, breathing in the hush of leaves overhead. He whispered, "I know you're there. I don't hate you, but I'm not you." A breeze passed, cool and steady, and for a moment Morty felt lighter. Later that evening, as he stood again by the window, the reflection appeared. Not the sharp, weary boy from before, but the shadowed one, darker, edges blurred. Morty's breath caught. He didn't run. He didn't look away. He met the gaze, soft but steady, and said, "Even if you're part of me, I choose the light." For the first time, the shadow blinked.
It didn't vanish.
It didn't smile. But Morty thought he saw it hesitate, as though even shadows are surprised by being seen with compassion. Then the glass held only his own face again, wide-eyed and breathing hard. Morty didn't tell anyone.
Not Rick, not his family, not even the stars.
He carried it quietly, like a stone in his pocket. Heavy, yes, but grounding too. Because he had learned something. Even in the presence of the echo, he was not powerless. He had a choice, always, and so Morty walked on. A little slower, perhaps. A little more thoughtful, but steadier, with each step answering the echo not with fear, but with a quiet, stubborn kindness. The garden behind Morty's house was small, more a scatter of untended soil and stubborn weeds than a true place of beauty. Yet at night, under the wash of moonlight, Even weeds could feel like wildflowers. Morty often wandered there when sleep seemed too far to reach. The stars were clearer above the open patch, their pulse steady as a heartbeat. It was there, one evening, that he found himself sitting with Summer. She hadn't meant to join him. She had come outside in irritation, slamming the door after some small argument with their parents. But when she saw him sitting cross-legged on the cool earth, staring upward as though the sky itself was whispering secrets, she hesitated. Something in his stillness softened her. Without a word, she sat down beside him, hugging her knees. For a while, they didn't speak. The garden hummed with the quiet sounds of night. Crickets rubbing their legs, a faint rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of a passing car.
Morty let the silence stretch, feeling the weight of it, the lightness within it.
He could sense her frustration still burning faintly, heavy and sharp, but also the gentler thread beneath it, the part of her that wanted to be heard.
Not dismissed. Finally she muttered, "They don't listen. It's like—"
"Nothing I say matters," Morty glanced at her.
"I listen," she scoffed, but it wasn't cruel.
It was tired. "Yeah, well, you don't count." "I do," Morty said softly. "At least to me." She turned her head to look at him, eyes catching a bit of the moonlight. There was something vulnerable in the way she stared, as if surprised to find someone holding space for her anger without trying to fix it. She exhaled, long and shaky, then looked back at the sky. Sometimes I feel invisible," she whispered. Morty thought of the window, of the reflections, of the shadow that had watched him silently. He thought of how even silence could feel like erasure if no one chose to witness it. "You're not invisible," he said after a while.
"I see you." The words weren't dramatic.
They weren't wrapped in wisdom, but they settled in her like a stone tossed gently into still water, sending ripples through her chest. She didn't reply right away. She just breathed, slower now, her shoulders easing. Morty didn't push. He knew sometimes the best kind of conversation was the one that left space between words. He felt the weight of her choices, whether to guard herself or soften, and he leaned gently toward the lighter thread. He picked a small weed from the dirt and twirled it in his fingers. "Remember when we were little and used to lie out here? Pretend the stars were telling us stories?" Summer gave a faint smile. "Yeah, you used to make up the weirdest ones. Like that one about the sandwich floating through space." Morty chuckled, the sound low and warm.
"I still think about that sandwich sometimes." She rolled her eyes, but the smile lingered. "You're so strange, Morty." "Yeah," he said.
"But you laughed back then, even when things were messy." Summer was quiet for a long time, then said, "You're different lately, calmer, like you're carrying something, but it's not crushing you." Morty hesitated. He thought of telling her about the weight of choices, about the reflections, about the shadow.
But instead he only said, "I'm just—"
"Trying to listen better," she tilted her head, considering. "Listening doesn't fix everything." "I know," Morty replied, "but sometimes it's enough." The words hung between them, fragile but steady. Summer looked at him again, eyes softer now. Her frustration loosened into something closer to relief. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, not for long, not dramatically, just enough to say, "I believe you." The stars pulsed above them, as if nodding in quiet approval. Morty felt a warmth spread through his chest, not just from being heard, but from offering that space for someone else. The garden no longer felt small. It felt vast, like a pocket of the universe where time slowed and softened. Summer eventually pulled away, hugging her knees again.
"Thanks, Morty," he smiled faintly.
"You don't have to thank me. I know, but I want to. And then silence returned, comfortable this time. They sat together, brother and sister, not fixing the world, not solving the storms of their family, only sharing the night. Morty thought of the reflection in the window, of the shadow that watched him, of the choices that bent like branches in the wind. And he realized something. Courage wasn't only for himself. It was also for these moments, the quiet ones, where simply being there for someone else was enough to shift the weight of the world. Later, when they rose to go inside, Summer touched his arm lightly.
Next time you're out here,
"Don't forget to invite me," Morty nodded, his heart steady. "I won't." That night, in his dreams, Morty found himself back in the garden, but the weeds had bloomed into wildflowers. The stars bent low, whispering softly, and Summer stood beside him, her laughter echoing faintly. He knew it wasn't just a dream, it was the echo of a bond strengthened, a reminder that love was not always grand or dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as sitting quietly together under the night sky, listening. When he woke, the memory of the garden lingered like a lullaby, soft and steady, a song of belonging. And Morty understood that relationships weren't about answers. They were about presence, about choosing to stand with someone even when the world did not notice. And so, with each breath, he carried that night with him, not as a story to tell, but as a steady flame, guiding him through the shifting echoes of his journey. The night carried a hush, the kind that falls when the world seems to pause for a breath. Morty felt it as he sat near the window once again, the glass cool against his fingertips. He could see the faint outline of his own reflection, layered over the soft glow of distant stars. But this time, something inside him stirred differently. The reflection no longer frightened him. It no longer felt like an intruder. It felt like an invitation, as though the shadow wished to lean forward to whisper something it could not say out loud. He blinked, and in the glass, the face shifted. Subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough that Morty's chest tightened. It was still his face, but older, sharper, and with a trace of something heavier behind the eyes, a flicker of a smile, crooked, knowing, distant. Morty recognized it, even if he wished not to. It was the mark of evil Morty. The realization didn't bring fear. Instead, it brought a strange calm, like finally recognizing the shape of a storm on the horizon. Morty didn't move away. He simply breathed long and steady, as though preparing to listen. "You always think it has to be complicated," the reflection seemed to say without sound. "But it isn't. Choice is simple. Power is simple. What you carry can either be yours or mine." Morty tilted his head slightly, speaking aloud, though his voice was soft enough that no one in the house could hear. "You're not real. You're just a thought in my head." The smile deepened, its silence pressing like a weight.
"And yet you're still speaking to me," Morty swallowed.
He could have turned away.
He could have run.
But something about the moment felt different from every story Rick had ever told him, every version of cleverness that relied on tricks, weapons, or noise. Morty didn't need to fight. He needed to listen. He remembered Summer in the garden, the sound of her voice softening when she realized she wasn't invisible. He remembered the woman at the crossroads, telling him courage wasn't always about running forward, it was about standing still, open, steady. So Morty whispered, "If you're really there, if you're really him, then what do you want from me?" The reflection's eyes gleamed, but the answer was not words. It was weight. Morty felt a tightening in his chest, like an invisible hand pressing against his heart.
A pull toward anger, toward bitterness, toward the endless cycle of being overlooked and underestimated.
He saw images flicker through the glass. Times Rick had ignored him, moments he'd been treated as a sidekick, the countless days when he felt small, replaceable. The shadow wanted him to give in, to lean into that bitterness, to let resentment sharpen him into something cruel. Morty breathed slowly, in and out. He let the weight press, but he did not grasp it. He remembered Summer's head resting briefly on his shoulder. He remembered the laughter over a silly story about a sandwich in space. He remembered the woman at the edge of the forest, her voice saying, "The world is heavy, and yet you hold it." Softly, Morty whispered to the reflection. "I don't need to outsmart you."
I just need to not become you, the reflection faltered.
Its smile wavered for a moment, almost imperceptible. "You think kindness makes you strong?" It pressed, voice vibrating in his mind, though no sound crossed the air. Morty nodded, steady.
Not strong, just enough. And in that moment, the pull began to ease.
Not vanish entirely. He could still feel it, like a thread tugging at the edges of his mind, but lessen, loosen. The reflection no longer pressed with certainty. Its smile dimmed into something unreadable, a shadow retreating just enough to let the stars reclaim their glow in the glass. Morty leaned back from the window, exhausted but steady. He realized something important. Winning didn't have to mean defeating. Sometimes winning meant holding your ground, refusing to give away the gentle parts of yourself, no matter how loud the shadows became. He lay down in his bed, still watching the stars beyond the glass. The air felt lighter now, though the echo of evil Morty remained, lingering at the edges. Morty did not hate him for it. He did not even fear him. He simply acknowledged that they were two branches of the same tree, grown in different directions. And Morty chose his own branch, his own path, one that bent toward kindness, even when the world told him it was foolish. Sleep drifted to him slowly, like mist creeping across a quiet field. His last thought before slipping under was simple, that no matter what waited in other reflections, he would meet them with listening, with presence, with gentleness, not because it was easy, but because it was his choice. In his dream, he walked again through the forest where the woman had spoken to him.
Only this time he wasn't alone.
Summer walked beside him, holding a small lantern that cast a golden glow across the path. He noticed the shadow moving just behind them, tall and sharp, its features shifting like smoke. But the shadow did not lead. It did not control. It simply followed, quieter now, as if uncertain. Morty glanced back once, meeting its eyes, and instead of fear, he offered a soft nod, a wordless acknowledgement that even shadows longed to be seen. The figure blinked, then thinned into the darkness, leaving behind only the sound of leaves rustling gently in the night air. The dream continued, not with urgency, but with calm wandering. Morty and Summer walked slowly, listening to the hum of crickets, the distant call of owls, the soft crackle of lantern flame. They didn't need to speak. Their presence together was enough. Morty felt the garden's memory in his chest, the weight of stars watching overhead, and the truth of his own steady breath. When he woke, morning had only just begun. The sky outside his window was pale blue, the edges of clouds brushed with gold. For the first time in many nights, Morty didn't rush to check the glass. He didn't need to. He knew the reflection would be waiting. But he also knew it didn't own him. His choices were his own. He sat up, stretching softly, the faintest of smiles curling his lips. Somewhere, far away, evil Morty still plotted, still wove threads of control and bitterness. But here, in this quiet room, Morty had made a different choice. A choice to listen, to soften, to hold kindness close, and perhaps that was the quietest, most unexpected kind of outsmarting there was. The morning after the dream unfolded gently, with the air carrying a hush that felt as though the world itself had slowed its steps. Morty lingered in bed longer than usual, watching dust float lazily through a shaft of sunlight. The light bent across his room, touching the clutter of books and forgotten trinkets, making them seem softer, almost sacred. He lay there breathing, noticing how steady he felt. No urgency, no push, just stillness that asked nothing of him. Downstairs, voices rose and fell. His parents arguing over something trivial, the way the coffee had been brewed perhaps, or who had forgotten to pay a bill. The sound didn't dig into him the way it used to. It passed like weather, loud for a moment, but drifting. Morty stretched his fingers and sat up, remembering the way he had spoken to his reflection. Not with anger, not with fear, but with choice. And choice, he realized, had a way of spilling outward. When he finally padded down to the kitchen, Summer was already there, spooning cereal into her mouth with a slowness that suggested she hadn't quite woken up. She glanced at him, eyes narrowing, then softening. Something unspoken flickered between them, the memory of the garden, of laughter, of sitting together without the need to fix anything. "You slept?" she asked, her tone carrying a note of surprise. Morty nodded, pouring himself a glass of water. "Yeah, better than I thought I would." She studied him for a moment, then gave a half-smile. "Good, you look..."
Lighter.
He shrugged, embarrassed, though a warmth spread quietly through his chest. It was strange how even a simple acknowledgement from someone close could shift the way the morning felt. He sat down across from her, the clink of her spoon against the bowl, filling the silence. For a while, that was enough, the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy, but instead gave room to breathe. Rick stumbled in not long after, muttering something under his breath, hair sticking out in every direction. He didn't greet them, just rummaged for a flask and took a long sip, as though it were water. Morty waited for the usual jab, the careless insult, but it didn't come. Rick barely looked at him. For the first time, Morty felt no sting in the lack of recognition. He realized he didn't need Rick's validation to hold himself steady. Later that day, Morty walked to the edge of town. There was a bench near an old playground where the swings squeaked with age. He sat there, hands folded in his lap, watching the wind stir the sand. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying like birdsong. Morty felt no urge to join, no ache of separation. Instead, he simply listened, letting the sound wash through him like water through stone. An older man sat down beside him after a while. His clothes were worn, his beard patchy, his eyes carrying lines of fatigue. For several minutes, they sat without exchanging a word, both staring at the playground as if it were a shared screen. Eventually the man sighed, rubbing his knees. "Funny, isn't it?" The stranger murmured.
"How kids can make everything seem lighter."
"Even when the world feels heavy," Morty nodded, speaking softly. "Yeah, I guess it's because they don't know the weight yet." The man chuckled, though there was no bitterness in it. Or maybe they do. Maybe they just carry it differently, looser. They fell into another pause. Morty glanced at him, noticing the tremor in his hands, the way he stared at the children with something between longing and regret. And Morty, instead of asking questions or offering advice, simply stayed present. He remembered the lesson of the garden, of Summer's words, of the way silence could cradle someone more tenderly than speech. The man finally stood, dusting off his pants. He looked at Morty, eyes tired but softer now.
"Thanks, kid, for sitting."
"Sometimes that's all anyone needs." Morty only nodded. The man walked away, shoulders not quite as heavy. As the sun dipped lower, Morty lingered on the bench, replaying the moment. It struck him that his quiet choice, to listen, to be still, had rippled outward. He hadn't solved anything. He hadn't offered wisdom. Yet something had shifted in the man's steps, and that was enough. When he returned home, Summer was waiting on the porch. She raised an eyebrow. "Where'd you go?" "Just sat at the park," Morty answered. She looked puzzled.
"That's it?"
"Yeah," he smiled faintly.
"That's it." She shook her head, but there was no judgment in her expression. "You're weird, but..."
"Keep being weird. It suits you." Morty laughed softly, the sound blending with the evening air. He realized that change didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need to be loud or dramatic. It lived in these moments, sitting with strangers, sharing silence with his sister, breathing steadily when shadows pressed against him. That night, Morty returned to his window. The reflection was waiting, faint as always, but this time, when he met its eyes, there was no sharpness.
Only stillness.
He lifted his hand, pressing it gently against the glass, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement. "You can stay there," Morty whispered,
I'm staying here. The reflection flickered, its expression unreadable.
Then it faded, leaving only Morty's own face bathed in moonlight. He didn't need to know if evil Morty had truly been there, or if it was just his own shadow taking shape. Either way, he felt no fear. He felt only steadiness, as though the ground beneath him had settled. He climbed into bed, the softness of the blanket pulling him down. His eyes closed slowly, breath evening out, and in the space between waking and dreaming, he felt a quiet certainty that kindness, even unspoken, had weight, that listening could be a kind of strength. That presence itself was a form of love. In his dream, he walked again through the lantern-lit forest. This time, more figures walked beside him, not only Summer, but also the stranger from the bench, and even the faint outline of his reflection.
None of them spoke.
They only walked together, steps soft against the path, guided by a light that flickered but never went out. Morty felt no need to lead,
No need to follow. Only to walk.
and in that rhythm he discovered something rare. Peace, not as a destination, but as the journey itself. The days that followed unfolded with a softness Morty hadn't expected. Time felt less like something rushing past and more like a stream he could step into, cool and steady, without fear of being carried away. He began to notice the quiet patterns of his life, the way the sun filtered through the blinds each morning, the sound of Summer tapping her pencil absent-mindedly while she studied, the low hum of Rick's machines in the garage. Small rhythms, steady heartbeats of ordinary existence, weaving themselves into something larger. Morty found himself reflecting on the threads that tied him here, to this place, to these people. The arguments at breakfast, the long silences on the porch, the laughter that came in bursts and vanished just as quickly. Once he might have thought of them as noise, as fragments that didn't quite fit together. But now he began to see them as part of a larger story, one not about victory or brilliance, but about persistence, about showing up again and again in the face of imperfection. One evening, he sat outside as the sky blushed with sunset, colors bleeding from gold into deep blue. The air was warm, carrying the scent of grass and faint traces of rain. Summer joined him without asking, settling into the chair beside his. They didn't speak at first, both watching the sky as if waiting for it to reveal something. The silence between them was different now, not heavy, not distant, but filled with the comfort of knowing someone else was breathing beside you. Finally, Summer murmured, "Do you ever think about what we'll leave behind?" Morty turned his head, surprised.
Like after we're gone?
She shrugged, not meeting his gaze.
Not in some big dramatic way.
Just the little stuff. What people remember when they think of us. Morty leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach.
I used to think about it. A lot.
Like I had to do something big to matter. And now? He smiled faintly. Now I think maybe the little stuff is the big stuff. Summer looked at him then, really looked, and her eyes softened. She didn't laugh or tease. She just nodded, as though she understood more than she wanted to say. They sat in that understanding for a long time, the colors of the sky deepening until stars began to prick through. Later that night, Morty found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts moved like slow waves, carrying him back through the small moments that had shaped him. The woman at the crossroads, her hand warm as she told him he carried the world. The stranger on the bench, shoulders lighter after nothing more than quiet companionship. Summer's head resting against his shoulder, her whisper that she sometimes felt invisible. Each memory glowed softly, not sharp like lightning, but steady, like lanterns lining a dark path. They were proof that a life's meaning didn't need to arrive all at once. It unfolded gently, in the way others carried your presence long after the moment itself had passed. Morty rose from bed and went to the window. His reflection was there again, faint as always, but this time it looked almost ordinary. just his face, layered over the glow of starlight. He touched the glass with his fingertips and whispered, "We're both here, and that's enough." The reflection didn't shift, didn't smile or sneer. It simply mirrored him, silent, steady. Morty felt no fear in that. Perhaps even shadows could rest if you didn't feed them with resistance. The following morning, Morty wandered into the kitchen to find Rick hunched over a blueprint, muttering calculations under his breath. For once, Rick didn't snap at him. Instead, he glanced up, eyes bloodshot, but sharp, and said, "You've been different lately, Morty." Morty blinked, unsure what to say. Different how? What to say? Different how? Rick studied him for a long moment, then waved a dismissive hand.
Less pathetic, I guess.
More grounded. "Don't get used to me saying that." Morty almost laughed, but he only nodded. He realized he didn't need Rick's praise or criticism to define him. Still, the words mattered. They were another thread, another small stitch in the fabric of his days. Later, Morty sat in the garden, the same patch of earth that had once been just weeds. He noticed tiny buds sprouting now, flowers beginning to push through where there had only been dirt. He smiled at the thought that perhaps nothing was truly barren forever. Even the hardest soil could bloom if given enough quiet time, enough patience. He closed his eyes and listened to the hum of life around him, the rustle of leaves, the faint buzz of insects, the soft creak of the porch swing as summer shifted her weight. Each sound was a note, and together they formed a lullaby, one written not in words, but in presence. In that stillness, Morty thought of legacy. Not the kind Rick chased across galaxies, not the kind evil Morty carved with fear and control, but the kind woven in these small, steady acts. Sitting beside someone in silence, choosing kindness even when bitterness beckoned, holding a reflection without letting it define you. That was the kind of legacy that mattered, the kind that didn't need to be remembered by crowds.
Only by the few who truly saw you as night fell.
Morty whispered to himself, almost like a prayer. May the little things be enough. The words lingered in the air, soft and steady, before dissolving into the dark. When sleep came, it carried him back into the forest of dreams. The lantern light glowed brighter now, and the path stretched farther than before. More figures joined him, faces from fleeting encounters, people he had offered nothing more than a moment of listening, a fragment of kindness. They walked with him quietly, their presence neither heavy nor demanding. Just there, just enough. Morty felt no need to lead, no need to understand where the path ended. The journey itself was its own gift, and as he walked, he realized legacy was not something left behind. It was something carried forward, step by step, in the hearts of others. When he woke, the morning was pale and gentle. The house stirred around him, voices rising and falling, machines humming, the world unfolding in its imperfect rhythm. Morty lay still for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the echo of the dream linger like the last notes of a lullaby. And for the first time, he didn't wonder what tomorrow would bring. He didn't wonder who he would become or what his reflection might whisper. He only thought of this, that today he could listen. Today he could choose. Today he could love in small, quiet ways. And that, he decided, was enough. The last days of summer unfolded with a hush, as though the world itself knew that Morty had come to the end of something. The air was heavy with warmth, carrying the smell of cut grass and faint traces of rain on hot pavement. Cicadas sang their endless lullaby, a steady rhythm that wrapped around everything like a soft blanket. Morty noticed how the days seemed longer and shorter at once, sunlight lingering, shadows stretching, yet each evening arriving before he was ready. He found himself walking more often, drifting through familiar streets with no destination in mind. The neighborhood looked the same, yet felt changed. Houses still leaned into each other, porches still sagged, mailboxes still leaned crooked, but Morty saw them differently now. He saw the lives inside, the tired parent washing dishes, the child pressing a face to the window, the old man trimming hedges with patient hands. They were fragments of stories, small and quiet, but alive with their own kind of meaning. One afternoon, Morty returned to the bench by the playground. The swings squeaked as before, though this time they were empty. The air was still, the sand untouched. Morty sat and let the silence wash through him. He thought of the stranger who had once shared this space, of the way his shoulders had eased after nothing more than company. Morty wondered if somewhere, at that very moment, the man was sitting a little straighter, breathing a little easier, carrying forward the gift of a quiet presence. It struck Morty then that legacy was less like a monument and more like a ripple. Small actions carried forward unseen, moving through the world long after the moment had passed. He smiled faintly, letting the thought settle. As evening came, Morty found Summer on the porch swing. She didn't look up when he sat beside her, but she shifted just enough to make room. They swayed together, the creak of the chains blending with the hum of crickets. After a long pause, she said, "I think I get it now. What you meant about the little stuff being the big stuff." Morty tilted his head. "Yeah?" She nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. Maybe it doesn't matter if people remember our names. Maybe what matters is if they remember how they felt when they were around us." Morty felt his chest warm, a steady glow.
Exactly. They swayed in silence after that, the porch light flickering above them, moths circling lazily.
Morty realized this too would become a memory. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady enough to linger. That night, Morty returned to his room, the familiar window, waiting. He looked into the glass and found only himself, his face soft, his eyes tired but gentle.
No shadow, no sneer.
Just Morty. He touched the glass lightly, not out of fear, but gratitude.
"Thank you," he whispered, unsure if he spoke to his reflection, to his shadow, or to himself.
Perhaps it didn't matter. Lying in bed, Morty let the sounds of the house surround him. His parents arguing faintly, Rick tinkering in the garage, Summer brushing her teeth down the hall. All of it imperfect, all of it ordinary, all of it real. He felt no urge to escape it, no ache for something grander. He simply let it be. Sleep came slowly, carrying him into the forest once more. The lantern glowed ahead, brighter than ever, and the path stretched wide. Figures walked beside him. Summer, the stranger from the bench, the woman from the crossroads, even faint shapes of countless others whose lives he had touched without realizing. They moved together in quiet rhythm, their steps steady, their silence full of presence. At the edge of the path, Morty paused. The lantern's light shimmered as though waiting for him to understand. He turned to the others, meeting their eyes, and felt the truth rise in him, that he was never walking alone, that every step was shared, every kindness echoed. He didn't need to see where the path led. It was enough to walk it, enough to listen, enough to be here. The dream faded softly, not with an ending but with a continuation, as though the story stretched beyond what he could hold. Morty woke before dawn, the world still dark, the house still quiet. He lay there breathing, feeling the weight of the dream settle like a blanket. For the first time, he didn't need to ask what it meant. He simply carried it, gently, like a lantern in his chest. The sky outside lightened slowly, stars dissolving into pale blue. Morty closed his eyes once more, letting himself drift not into sleep, but into rest. He thought of the garden blooming with wildflowers, of laughter over sandwiches in space, of reflections that no longer frightened him. He thought of the little things, the small kindnesses, the steady presences that formed the true legacy of a life, and as he breathed, slow and even, Morty realized something simple. He didn't have to become extraordinary to matter. He only had to be here, listening, loving, choosing.
That was enough.
That had always been enough. Somewhere deep inside, Morty felt the words form, gentle and final, like the last note of a lullaby. Everything's going to be okay, and with that, he let go, sinking into the soft exhale of rest. The air grew cooler as autumn arrived, carrying with it a softness that seemed to rest on everything Morty touched. The world slowed its rhythm. Trees shed their leaves one by one, each drifting spiral a quiet reminder that letting go could be beautiful. The mornings were crisp and pale, the evenings edged in gold, and Morty found himself listening more closely to the hush between sounds. Even footsteps on sidewalks seemed gentler now, echoing less like noise and more like heartbeat. Noise and more like heartbeat. He wandered through these days with a kind of tender attention, as though the world had turned into a book he didn't want to finish too quickly. He noticed the tilt of light on rooftops, the hush of wind folding through grass, the way people smiled without realizing. At times he would sit beneath a tree and simply breathe, counting the seconds until the sun dipped lower, until the sky turned violet and stars appeared. These small rituals felt like prayers, though Morty never said the words aloud. Sometimes Rick would shuffle past him, muttering about inventions or broken pieces of time. Morty no longer tried to follow, no longer strained to understand the weight Rick carried. Instead, he simply let him be. Sometimes kindness meant nothing more than not asking for explanations. And in that silence, Morty felt closer to Rick than he ever had before. It was as though their bond existed beneath language, a shared thread that didn't need constant proof. One evening, Morty found himself in the garage. The air smelled of metal and burnt circuits, wires spilling from the workbench in tangled heaps. Rick was asleep in his chair, head tilted back, mouth open, a small snore escaping with each breath. Morty stood quietly, watching the rise and fall of his chest. For so long he had seen Rick as towering, unreachable, and endlessly in motion. Now he saw an old man who simply needed rest. Morty placed a blanket over him, tucking it gently at the sides, and whispered, "It's okay. You can rest." He didn't wait for Rick to stir, didn't need acknowledgement. He just left the warmth behind. The seasons folded into each other. Morty began to notice how much of life was built from cycles, day into night, leaf into soil, word into silence. It made him wonder if people too carried their own seasons inside them. Childhood like spring, full of bloom and wild curiosity. Youth like summer, restless and bright. Adulthood like autumn, a gradual learning of release. And winter perhaps a kind of peace. Thinking this way made Morty feel less afraid of endings, because endings looked so much like beginnings in disguise. On a quiet afternoon, Summer joined him on a walk. They didn't speak much, but their steps matched without effort. At one point, she reached into her pocket and handed him a folded note. Morty opened it to find only one line, scrawled in her handwriting. "Don't forget that being gentle is still strength." Morty read it twice, then tucked it into his jacket, close to his heart. He didn't say thank you out loud because Summer would have brushed it off, but inside he carried the words like a lantern. Dreams returned, softer now, less like riddles and more like lullabies. In one dream, Morty walked through the same forest as before, but the trees no longer leaned over him. Instead, they stood tall and welcoming, their branches filled with glowing leaves. He felt no fear of shadows, no urge to rush. Along the path he saw faces, kind, fleeting, familiar, and strange. Each smiled as he passed, and he understood without words that they were all connected, their lights mingling like stars in a single sky. When Morty reached the clearing, the lantern stood in the center, brighter than ever. But this time he didn't reach for it. He simply sat nearby and let its glow fill him. When he woke, Morty carried the calm into his waking hours. He no longer searched for signs or waited for revelations. He let the day unfold, trusting it would hold what it needed. Some mornings he helped his mom in the kitchen, handing her plates without being asked. Some afternoons he played cards with Summer, both of them pretending not to care who won. Some evenings he sat quietly with his dad, watching television without following the plot, their laughter rising unexpectedly at the same moments. These were the stories he wanted to live, the ones too small to be remembered by history, but big enough to shape a life. Morty began to wonder if the true journey wasn't about answers at all.
Maybe it was about presence, about standing where you were and choosing to notice.
He thought of the stranger on the bench, of the woman at the crossroads, of Summer's note folded in his pocket, each moment a stitch weaving something larger than he could see. And the more he noticed, the more whole he felt. Late one evening, Morty lay beneath the stars, the grass cool against his back. He traced constellations with his finger, whispering names he remembered and inventing ones he didn't. The stars were endless, scattered and bright, yet somehow they looked like a map. Not a map of places, but of feelings, of connections, of all the small kindnesses glimmering in the dark. He thought of how even the faintest star still belonged to the sky, still mattered in the grand design. And he felt, for the first time, that he too belonged, no more and no less than the stars themselves. A wind brushed through the field, soft and steady, carrying the scent of earth and leaves. Morty closed his eyes and let it pass over him, through him, leaving him lighter than before. He thought of all the ways he had stretched, not in body, but in heart.
Stretched to listen, to forgive, to let go.
Stretched to become softer, not harder.
And he understood now that this was his strength, not the force of a hero, but the patience of one who stays gentle. The night deepened.
Somewhere nearby an owl called once, twice, then fell silent. Morty whispered back, a soundless thank you as though the world could hear him. He smiled, eyes still closed, body easing into the rhythm of rest. And in that stillness, Morty felt it, an exhale that wasn't just his own, but the world's, a shared breath, carrying him into peace. The final winter arrived gently, not as a storm, but as a hush. Snow fell in slow spirals, each flake drifting like a note from some forgotten lullaby. The world outside Morty's window was pale and quiet, blanketed in silver light. Street lamps glowed with halos, footsteps disappeared as soon as they were made, and the night sky stretched heavy with stars. Morty pressed his forehead to the glass, watching his breath fog and fade, and he felt something simple: stillness. The days slowed in a way that made every moment linger. Morty rose early, wrapped in blankets, listening to the soft groan of the house settling into cold. Sometimes he sat with a cup of tea, steam curling into the air, hands warmed by the mug. Other times he simply watched the frost creep across the window, drawing its patterns with steady patience. Nothing about these mornings was dramatic, yet they filled him with a fullness he could not name. Rick seemed quieter too. He still disappeared into the garage, still tinkered with half-finished inventions, but his voice had softened, his muttering more like humming. Morty noticed how he paused more often to sip from a flask, not in desperation, but as though savouring the small warmth it offered. Sometimes Rick would pass Morty in the hall and place a hand on his shoulder for just a moment, saying nothing. That brief touch was enough. It said all the words neither of them knew how to voice. Evenings belonged to the family. They gathered in the living room, wrapped in sweaters, the fire crackling as shadows flickered along the walls. They played old board games, told half-remembered stories, and laughed in ways that carried no weight. Morty cherished those moments most of all, the closeness, the ordinariness, the sense that nothing needed to be proven. It was enough to be together, enough to share warmth against the winter outside. Morty's dreams grew softer too. The forest still appeared, but now it was blanketed in snow. The lantern glowed warm against the pale ground, steady and unwavering. When Morty approached, he did not feel the need to question or to search. He simply sat beside it, resting in its light, letting the silence hold him. The figures who had once walked beside him still appeared, their outlines luminous in the snow. They no longer guided him, they simply shared the space. It was enough to sit together, breathing in rhythm, the glow weaving them into one. One morning, Morty wandered to the park. The swings were covered in frost, the slide dusted in white, the benches cold to the touch. He sat anyway, the cold seeping into him, crisp and clarifying. As he watched children run across the snow, their laughter sharp and pure, he thought of the man he had once met there, weary and quiet. Morty hoped he was somewhere warm, somewhere safe, still carrying the memory of being seen. Morty whispered into the air, "You're not forgotten?" And the words drifted upward like breath. Later that day, Summer found Morty sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a notebook. He had been writing down small fragments, memories, feelings, little pieces of the journey he never wanted to lose. Summer didn't tease him, didn't ask questions. She just sat beside him, and together they watched snow fall through the window. Morty realized then that legacy wasn't only about what people remembered. It was also about what people felt when they sat beside you in silence. As the days passed, Morty felt a gentle loosening inside him. He no longer needed to hold so tightly to questions, to answers, to fears. He had stretched enough, listened enough, carried enough. He began to understand that life wasn't about reaching some final clarity. It was about the spaces in between, the pauses, the quiet, the way light settled on a table at dusk. The truth lived not in explanations but in presence. Not in explanations but in presence. One night Morty stepped outside alone. The sky was so clear it looked endless, stars scattered across it like seeds. He breathed in the cold, sharp and cleansing, and tilted his head back. For the first time, he didn't feel small beneath the stars. He felt part of them, woven into their pattern, his light faint but steady. He whispered into the night, "I belong," and the stars seemed to nod in return. He thought then of all the moments stitched together across his journey. The quiet kindnesses, the reflections in glass, the laughter over sandwiches, the notes folded into pockets, the lantern glowing in the woods. They were not grand stories to be sung or carved into stone. They were gentler, smaller, but no less important. And Morty knew that these moments carried forward would ripple into others, into Summer, into Rick, into strangers he might never meet. That was enough. Back inside, Morty lay in bed, listening to the hush of the house. The pipes hummed faintly, the wind brushed against the walls, the fire cracked in the distance. He closed his eyes and felt gratitude swell in him, not for answers, but for the chance to have lived the questions. His breaths slowed, deep and even, matching the rhythm of the world around him. The dream came one final time. Morty walked the snowy path, the lantern ahead. When he reached it, he placed his hand upon the glass, warm despite the cold. He did not ask for guidance nor for certainty. He simply whispered, "Thank you." And as he turned away, the lantern's glow followed him, settling into his chest, steady and eternal. When he woke, dawn had begun to touch the horizon, pale light softening the edges of the world. Morty lay there for a long time, not rushing to rise, not needing to move. The day would come, as all days did, and he would walk through it with gentleness. That was all he needed now. He stretched beneath the blankets, slow and easy, like a tree reaching into the sky. He let the breath leave him in a long exhale, carrying with it all the weight he no longer needed. Somewhere, deep inside, Morty knew the truth. nothing was truly over. The story would continue in small ways, in laughter, in silence, in kindness, passed from one to another. And that was enough. And so the lantern dims, not in ending but in rest. The story has carried us through seasons of wonder, quiet kindness, and the gentle courage of simply being. If you've made it this far, know that you are part of this softness too, woven into the rhythm of the words, breathing alongside the silences. Stories like these don't close with answers, but with echoes. Echoes of laughter shared, of moments noticed, of love carried quietly through time. Let those echoes stay with you, like a lullaby that lingers even after the music fades. Thank you for walking this path, step by step, light by light. You are never alone here. You never will be. Sleep well, rest deeply, and remember, everything is going to be okay, man.